Innis is destroyed. So the trick to building this region is making something that was once cool and great, and then figuring out how over the last 20 years it's been obliterated by entropy. And so, I know you and I talked about themes and how each of the regions, one of the things we decided to do was put a theme overlaying on top of the region. I had that whole long conversation with you, via voice message, and then realized I was describing the theme of an entire other region. And I thought I was so into it, and then I realized, oh, wait, no. So, do you have any ideas on what the overall theme should be for this region?
So I've been thinking about it after the messages that you sent, trying to kind of sort out in my head kind of different directions that we can go. And it's interesting that you say now the kind of the direction, at least in your head, is like a place that was great and has kind of fallen apart. Because from some of the stuff that you had described before, with some of the other sort of tension points, to me it seemed like a place where the real disaster was like on the horizon, not in the past. That it was kind of in the process of building to something pretty scary. And I guess what I mean by that is, so there's this sort of like neutral agreement between Innis and the Dismembered Lord of like, we won't mess with you, you don't mess with us, just do your thing and we'll do our thing. And between the sort of crux idea that we had of like this neutral ground being potentially starting to get a little iffy, and the Lord of Ash in this area not being a Lord of Ash, having it someone who's basically taken their own control and has not been recognized yet. I think to me, like I could very well see this place, Innis, like being fully like reconquered or going into war, like with the Dismembered Legion soon, sort of thing. So maybe that's totally outside of the sort of scope of where this place was going in your mind. But at least that's kind of some of the notes that I was hitting on from some of the descriptions, which I think could be sort of an interesting way to frame it. So I have an idea as far as theme, but I wanted to at least put that out there because that kind of dovetails into the theme. So where does all that kind of sit with you?
That's fine. I think it's great. Yeah, so none of that, like I didn't bump into any of that. So I'm like, okay, cool, yeah, I'm there. I'm with you. I can kind of see that being the case. So what would the theme be? And then I'll cross-reference it against the ones that we kind of have tagged for certain places and just make sure it's not too similar, or if it is similar, we can make them different enough. So what are you thinking?
So the idea that I kind of had in my head, and when I say this, I mean purely in terms of like plot concept and not in terms of like technological effort. But something that sort of struck me through some of the descriptions that you were giving me and some of the thoughts that I was kind of having about the ways that this could go is almost like a World War I at the beginning sort of feeling. So like imagine basically, let me kind of explain that a little bit more. Of like imagine living in Europe and getting the news that Franz Ferdinand was shot, and then the other person being like, okay, well, we're not going to let that stand. And then their ally being like, okay, well, we're not going to let that stand. And then just like, oh God, this is going to be so messy. And then it is like, it just goes full tilt disaster. But that moment, that's like small sliver of time of like instigating incident, Franz Ferdinand is shot, to war, like that intervening period, I think is just got to be one of the most tense, miserable moments politically, like in history. So I could very much see Innis being in that period right now where the Lord of Ash has sort of been killed and conquered, but not acknowledged. And there's sort of this touching point of like, well, we had this neutrality agreement. Is that out the window now? Are we about to go to war? Like, of just like, so that kind of looming war on the horizon sort of feel like World War I is about to happen for Innis sort of thing. It was at least kind of the idea in my mind.
Yeah, that hits me really nicely. So at first I thought you were going to say the Cold War. When you said in terms of technology, I thought you were going to say that. So
yeah, I said that because obviously I'm not saying we have trench warfare or machine gun approximations or whatever, obviously, but it's just like in terms of that political tension is kind of what I meant by that. But yeah, Cold War I guess makes sense too. Yeah.
Well, and I think yours is more. It's way more fitting because, like you said, especially I think that the World War I reference matches the at least the informational tech level, where, like you said, you would hear that Franz Ferdinand was shot, I would imagine, through a newspaper the next day, maybe, or from you know what I mean. So it's kind of like that strikes me as the pace of Dragongrin, where it would sort of be these rumor mills. I like that it's the impending war, because that immediately, and you probably thought the same thing, Countdown to Ruin is basically, right, it's a boom, and then it the last few bullets are like World War I happening, Now, I think that works. Right now, Talus, the elven floating life tree, thing, they're in civil war, and they're kind of at war with, it's kind of like this three-way war with this mercenary faction called the Granach Thane, and then the two sort of elven factions, ones who think one way and one who think the other. I think this is tonally different enough. There's a difference between all-out war and like a country ravaged by civil war versus this sort of tensions and picking sides and stuff like that. But how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I had thought of that it does kind of start to nudge up close to the similar sort of atmosphere as Talus. But I agree in the sense that it's a little bit different for two reasons. Like you say, one, there's a big difference between we're fighting, troops on the ground, people in the streets, guns going off. Obviously not guns in Dragongrin, but you know what I mean. Versus that sort of like looming dread of like, these may be our last moments of peace that we're living through right now, so we need to figure out what's going on. Also, I don't think that, war is probably the accurate description for it, in the sense that this is them not getting in trouble with another faction, but they're getting in trouble with the dismembered lord. Like, this is edging towards what's essentially revolution or treason. So I think in the dismembered lord mind, this isn't war, this is crushing a region who's defying you now, like openly. So I think that it's probably not going to be much of a fight, in the sense that if the dismembered lord wants these people down, he's going to put them down. And it's going to be bloody, and he's going to lose some troops, but, for him, in the long run, that's a drop in the bucket. Where for the people in Innis, I think it's a much bigger deal. But I think that feeling of like, are we really going to... I'm not sure how familiar you are with like... the June Rebellion in France. It's some of the stuff that like Les Miserables sort of references, of like these like school kids in France, like after the French Revolution, like a different rebellion, were like, yeah, we're gonna rebel, and then just nobody joined them. Like it was just college kids with guns, and the French military just destroyed them. So I imagine that like that sort of atmosphere is kind of very much kind of what I'm imagining, of like, we feel it's right in our hearts to fight for our own rights and to try to take control, even if we die, even if it's a slaughter. That's important enough to us to like sustain our own culture and to pursue our own goals, that we're going to try it. Which I think is very different from like civil war, clan warfare sort of thing. So I'm with you that I think it's different enough that it's going to feel like a different place to Talus.
Yeah. And I think so. Let's lock that in. Let's lock it in, and then kind of figure out, my first thought would be just trying to poke a couple of holes in the execution of it. Like, and we don't have to answer these questions immediately. They could come as we sort of talk, but some things to keep in mind. The first thing is you kind of mentioned, which is anytime something big like this happens in Dragongrin, any astute reader says, well, why? Why doesn't the dismembered lord just swoop in like Dracula and kill them all with creeping death, And so our hand wave answer that for the sake of narrative reasons, there is, he can't upset this world he's cobbled together through the time stream that much at once. Now, if we want to come up with a different reason, I did have one. I don't know if we want to go too far down that rabbit trail, but just kind of to throw this in the bucket, the way I've always imagined the orcs and the dismembered lord is that they were both upstarts when they first made this deal 20 years ago. And I kind of like the idea that the dismembered lord has a personal relationship, maybe even a saved life or like one of those kind of camaraderie relationships with one of the leaders of the orcs. And maybe that's too personal and makes it a little too, human, but I've always loved that the dismembered lord was human. So anyway, thinking of a reason why this would even be a problem and that it wouldn't always end in the dismembered lord swoops in and stops the whole thing, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, so I think that so for one, kind of leaning into the sort of original agreement that allows this place to be here as it is now, of like, well, they had a deal before of like, hey, I'm fighting this war. You guys in Innis, just stay out of it. And then at the end of the day, I'll let you keep your land and I'll give you this extra land. And then you can have a nice, comfortable little space for yourself while I do all my stuff across the rest of the world. And that agreement was made, like the contract and the treaty signed, whether literally or maybe even, either metaphorically treaty signed or maybe even literally. So I think that there's like, at a certain point of like, hey, well, we made a deal, and like the dismembered lord, for all the terrible things that he's done, he made a deal, and maybe that's important, maybe it's not, and he's planning to do this at some point later anyways. But at least for now, it's just like, I got plenty of other things to deal with. Some of the other stuff we've talked about in some of the other regions, there's plenty of conflict for the dismembered lord to quell. So if this place is still like mostly under wraps, then it's probably not worth the effort to like exact harsh immediate justice. But it's the sort of thing that if they start going down this trail more and more, then it starts to have a bad image of like, well, if this region can get away with it, then maybe ours can, and chain reactions can start in that sort of sense. So I think like at the start of where the countdown to ruin is sort of going to start, because I had the exact same idea of like, well, this is basically just the countdown to ruin, It starts off with like some tension, and then at the end of it is like the dismembered lord clamps down, full stop, and like tries to conquer this place back again. But I think at the start, they haven't done enough yet to like require that sort of, insane, harsh judgment from the dismembered lord of like, okay, well, this person's like taken the reliquary of Ash. They're the new Lord of Ash. That's technically allowed. We just need to like formalize it. And so that's the sticking point. We're like, okay, well, if you just come, submit, I'll approve, and we'll do that whole song and dance, and then you'll be the Lord of Ash, and then we're all legal, so there's no problems. And it's not until that they refuse and escalate that it starts to become something that the dismembered lord needs to deal with. So I think that it's easy, to kind of justify why this is just now starting to happen. Based off of some of the other stuff you told me about the region. I don't think it's a huge problem. I think that it's kind of easy to find that sort of sticking point of like why this is the beginning of a chain reaction that's yet to happen, rather than like something that could have happened in the past. Yeah,
and I think let's anchor in. I love that, and I had the same sort of vibe that the dismembered lord wouldn't outright break his word. Not unless he was forced to or some sort of extreme measure. So I really like that because I just like that. I like that quality in a person. And one of the things I've always tried to do when we're writing the dismembered lord is keep him strangely likable. Like awful, but and likable is not the right word, but just it's like, okay, cool. Well, you know what? I can respect those traits, even though he's awful. So I liked that a lot. And then I also liked what you were saying is that this is not a problem yet. It is a potential problem. And the resources that he has, I think he works very hard to make them appear as though they're infinite. But I think that they are finite in some level. And he's got things all over the place. So you don't deal with the problem until it's a problem. You know.
Yeah, exactly. And I had the sort of same kind of perception of like, yes, the propaganda, all the Murrow would say, the Dismembered Lord sees everything, he knows everything, and he acts immediately with harsh judgment, and he has more troops than you could possibly imagine. Of course, everyone's going to say that, and it's going to feel that way to some people. But the reality is that at the end of the day, the Dismembered Lord isn't a god. He's exceptionally powerful, but he's not infinitely powerful. And he does not have infinite people. And based on some of the other stuff for some of the regions, people are not his biggest problem. There are bigger threats to the Dismembered Lord than orcs. You know, even if it's a bad look for his rule to have rebellion, it hasn't gotten that far yet. And he has a lot of stuff to deal with. So, yeah, I'm with you.
So cool. Awesome. All right, well then let's lock all that in. Let's go with the next thing we jump into can be any of a few things. We can, I know we talked about wanting to flesh out the orcs a little bit. That's an option. We can also talk about, all the regions we've tried to put this sort of third party or this outside threat. So we can kind of talk about some of that, or we could talk about some of the cultures that would be there. Any of those are fine with me as anything, or something totally different that you might have in mind.
Yeah, so I think, nailing down the overall theme was kind of the big starting point, because I think that'll kind of help to decide where everything else falls in. But, yeah, so we kind of talked about some of the cultural parts, which I think is kind of a good next step, because I think doing the outside threat is going to be, I think, easier to balance and make it really fit conceptually with the region if we kind of know what the people are like here first, because then the threat can be something that kind of acts against important quality to the people. I think that just kind of makes it easier to make it a real conflict rather than just, well, they're scary monsters and that's kind of bad, so we should probably fight them. Like if we can have a little bit, which is like that's fine and that's usable, but I think that it could be cooler. But I think in order to kind of find where that's going to sit, then we need to know what these people are about, so we can kind of dig into those things.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because that's one of the things I'm really proud of about the regions is that it feels almost like their own movie. Or something like that. Like it's almost like, no, this is, it's its own world within the world, and then it fits. So I think you're right. So it's almost like coming up with the protagonist, is usually what you do first, so that then you come up with a villain or that outside threat. In this case would be whatever it is that would make the most sense to stop or impede or, make it rough for the other two parties in some way. How did you feel, talking about that? We know we have the orcs, so maybe let's wait to dive into their specifics. We have the Ardor, who we know are the drudges, so they're the captors there. I would like to, at some point, kind of figure out their exact deal, like what that looks like, which that might not even be in the scope of what we're doing tonight, but and then how did you feel about the Drogus being the second culture and sort of being those construction workers, because they're scrappers and they're diggers. So the orcs sort of are like, hey, clear this out and you can keep anything you find, but you have to do it to these specifications in these way. And the Drogus are very superstitious, so I also imagine that we kind of play with that as well. Like the orcs are very mythical, so they have these very specific things they have them do, whether or not the Drogus believe that it actually does anything. It's kind of like, you have to take the first shovel of dirt while doing X or Y, like these weird things. So then you have this little conflict of, are these, Drogus construction workers going to actually follow these rules if they need to get the job done and stuff like that. So how do you feel about that kind of being the second culture, this kind of Drogus above ground dwellers?
Yeah. When you very first kind of said it as an idea, I was like, I don't know. But then, like, the second you started kind of going into it, I was like, oh, wait, no, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Especially because I think, like you said, the orcs themselves are not going to be tied into, like, the choosable mechanics for this area. So given that sort of constraint, because that's like the obvious answer of like, yeah, you have the orcs and you have the Ardor, but it's like, okay, no, because that's not quite enough. So yeah, I think the Drogus makes a lot of sense. As you said, Sphere Below is like very close by to this region, which I think makes it easy to justify in terms of geography of like, well, like you were saying in one of the voice messages, well, how did these people even get here if it's, across the world? Like, why are they here? But it's not, And I think that for their sort of, salvage-based culture, that it would make sense that at least some of them would expand past the ocean salvage scene, especially because doing the gig here for the orcs actually would be a pretty sweet deal for them, in terms of all their options of like, well, you can salvage the horribly dangerous, treacherous oceans filled with terrible monsters, or you can just like mill around, clear out this field for some orcs and get still good pay with like way less hazard. Which I think it would only make sense that for a sort of opportunistic sort of salvage culture that like, yeah, why wouldn't they be here? Like it'd be a nice, safer gig, probably less lucrative, but I think some of them at least would care more about the fact that they're not going to die every single time they go out for work, over making a little bit of extra money.
Yeah, I dig it. Yeah, cool, awesome. So, all right, well then let's just tentatively put that in and say, okay, cool, unless we come up with something that makes a lot more sense or that hits us in the middle, I think that works. Because one of the other things that I wanted to incorporate was the Drogus are very opportunistic, and I would say they're morally gray. So they tend toward following their own rules more than I would say it that way rather than they're all crooked. But they're very opportunistic to follow their own rules. So I think they would definitely have, like, I dreamt up this sort of organization called Kreider's Hook. And it was basically just this network of secret routes and maybe even, like, safe places that help some of these Ardor escape into Sphere Below or into Feygrave. Basically, they're not sympathetic to their cause. They are desiring coin and money and things, information, stuff like that. So I thought that could also be kind of a cool thing because they're one of the only cultures that it fit, where I was like, they would easily do this, and some would risk it for the money.
Yeah, and a thought that I just had, as you were kind of describing that, I think that it would make a lot of sense right now, and kind of, this would serve a couple of purposes. Regional tension and kind of going into what you said of kind of getting some of these Ardor out of here, not for the love of their freedom, but for the opportunity and potential for profit that would be in it. Of the Drogus are, not stupid. None of these cultures are stupid. They can see the writing on the wall, the orcs pushing the buttons of the marrow starting to push back a little bit. If something's going to go down here, they want to have an easy way out, I imagine, of like, whoa, we came here because it was safe and easy, and now you're starting wars? Like, okay, let's maybe watch what we do here a little bit better. But if things start to get worse and worse, then they're going to want to leave and get out of here. At least some of them. I'm not saying like a full Drogus exodus out of Innis, but at least some amount of them are going to be like, okay, this isn't worth it anymore because now this is more dangerous than Sphere Below is. And that was the opposite of the point. But since I'm here, I'm getting a boat or a whatever, however you get to Sphere Below from Innis, the easiest. I don't know what sort of transportation that would be. But like, we're already chartering a trip back to Sphere Below anyways. We'll take you with us. We're already going. And you just have to, work for us when you get down there, and we'll pay you a wage, and you do some work, or whatever it is, and then kind of use that as kind of a jumping off point for how some of that might work.
But you were basically just saying that the Drogus were opportunistically, like they're opportunistically making this route for themselves Now, maybe it started as a way to make an extra buck, but they start to sort of fortify it and make it much more robust because they're like, hey, we need to be able to get out of here if a war breaks out.
Yeah, so basically, like, for now, it's kind of like, we're building this escape route for us if we need it, but since we have the escape route now, we might as well use it to make some money while we're here. We have the route, we have the plans laid for us to use it if we need to get out of here. But since it's all ready and you want to get out of here and you'll pay us, or do labor for us or something for X amount of time if we bring you down to somewhere else and free you, then hey, we have the tools, might as well use them, make some money, and if we need them to get the heck out of here later for ourselves, we'll have the infrastructure in place in order to do that, which I think could be kind of a really neat way to tie the cultures in like that.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's great. It's really smart, and it's one of those things that it makes so much sense that it's like, oh yeah, it all just gels very well for me. So I'd say let's lock that in. And then the next thing, because I think we've done a good job of like, hey, this might be an issue, and then we're knocking these things out. One of the other things was all the other regions are built really well for sort of any adventuring party, and this one is a little more restrictive. And so I didn't know if it was basically you could just wander in there because it's very neutral. It's very like, I think the orcs are probably a different kind of dangerous. So you got to kind of take your lumps one or the other. But I was wondering if we should put some sort of a hand wavy, like, I don't know if I want to do like a city in the middle or like, I don't know. I just couldn't think of a reason why. I was kind of thinking of like maybe like a keep in the middle or some sort of like town. I don't know. I don't want to complicate it, but can you think of a reason why adventurers would be there outside of they're a drudge, they're working with the marrow, or they're helping the Drogus? It just seems like maybe that is a little more exclusive than the other regions.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And it's not really something that totally... It's like one of those things that I like felt somewhere under the surface, but like it didn't register in my brain. And like the moment you said it was like, oh, yes, that's a thing that we should be careful about.
So I think we were talking about the, I'd like to find a way to make it so that adventurers could come there and not make it so narrow. And I actually had an idea.
Okay, yeah, because I totally know what you're saying. But yeah, if you have a solution, I'm down to hear it.
Cool. So we got to dial in the specifics. But I was super feeling like, what if it's identical to the California Gold Rush? Like, maybe the stuff that the orcs are doing, whatever that resource is now, immediately it's Dragongrin. So I'm like Archons, which are like the Titan relics, or like Valens, which are like the primordial relics. Well, as far as the in-game stuff, if you find something from a Titan, it's called an Archon. If you find a primordial, it's like literally a piece. So like they're really big like kaiju creatures, so you could find like, pieces of their talons and all this, and they have different properties. So we can do something totally different as far as a resource goes, but the rule, we like to try to use stuff that already exists in world. So to make it special, I was thinking that maybe what the orcs are doing, and this terraforming and all the digging and all this stuff, has either uncovered this really rare cache of like very, very good condition stuff where it's like, oh my gosh, or even maybe, and it can be a both and, maybe it could also be something where it's like good condition stuff has been unearthed because of all the digging and craziness. That makes the most sense logically, but I think you could also make it so that in addition, some of this stuff has kind of weird, wacky properties, or is even a little more amped up than it usually would be because of all this magic that's bombarding the area.
Yeah, so I definitely like the idea. So to kind of poke at it and kind of see what sticks from it. So with, I guess it just depends on how ubiquitous these sorts of Titan and Primordial things are versus like how much that they're a function of certain regions. Because so like something like Sphere Below, I think is going to be very ripe for the sort of like Titan salvage sort of thing. Like somewhere like Zaman, I think is going to be really big in terms of like the primordial stuff. So I'm not totally sure. This isn't something that we've ever talked about. How much are Titan and primordial artifacts ubiquitous across the regions, and they're a feature, like obviously more some places, less others. But is it something that's everywhere, or is it something that's kind of going to be a feature of that place? Because I think it could start to easily wane in if it's important to be in a specific place. Like I said, some of those other regions kind of cover some of those gaps. But if it's something that fits everywhere, and like you say, these ones could very easily be different as a function of all like the bleak worship and the bleak magic that the orcs use, I think could very have a transformative effect that makes these unique in a certain way. But I just kind of wanted to throw that out there and kind of see your immediate reaction to that sort of idea.
Yeah, sure. So it's intended to be ubiquitous. It's intended to be, and as you say, it's, it can be featured in certain areas very heavily, or at least a story point to how it affects a certain region or why. But we have this subsystem called Archons, the Relics of the Titans, and it's basically a little like treasure hunting thing that generates these magic baubles and items and things. It's meant to kind of be like, there's even a background called an Archon Hunter, so you can kind of just be that person anywhere. And, so very high level, these are relics from this Age of Annihilation, and the idea is that these creatures were so prolific and large and powerful that whatever extinction event happened, they are just under the surface. Their whole deal is right under the surface, right? And so the more that Dragongrin gets eroded and messy and, entropy, more of this stuff that shows through. So, yeah, definitely ubiquitous.
That's kind of spurring a bit here for me then. So, you mentioned that this particular part of the land, like the orcs had not been here originally, and that sort of something else had been here. What was the something else before the orcs got this land from the dismembered? Was it just the Ardor as a people were here, or was it like unclaimed, or the Ardor?
The Ardor and whatever else you think. But right now it was just kind of like the sprawling forces of these people who were decimated and purposefully destroyed afterward. Like no brick shall remain, like raise the place. I also had a quick side thing I wanted to tell you, which was at one point the orc culture had a very sort of almost religious affinity toward rebuilding things their way, but using things. So the art for the landscapes for this place is basically these castles that look like they've just been totally deconstructed and made into different shapes using the same bricks and stuff. So I just thought that was a cool aesthetic. Honestly, it was kind of like, oh, I think that would be neat. So like even the Ardor's shackles in their cultural trinkets, other cultures have these cool trinkets. They have shackles that are made out of like a shield. So it has their emblem in their own shackles. I thought that was just really cool imagery. So anyway, I'm going to throw it to you, but that's kind of the whole word vomit of the answer there.
Okay, yeah. So I don't want to get too off into that as its own thing yet, but the reason that I ask is that my first thought was like, so I think a lot of places would have kind of dug up a lot of these things already, so that it's not sort of as ripe for people to like come in and look for them. Like if you find them or if you know exactly where to look, sure. But if there's some sort of reason that the lands here could have not been nearly as tapped for those sorts of things as some of the other places might have been, that might cause that sort of gold rush influx that you're talking about of like, oh wait, there's a huge stash of Titan stuff under Innis that nobody's touched yet. Like, let's get there and let's get some of that because that's going to make us a fortune, sort of thing. But I don't know with the Ardor and their sort of culture stuff. We haven't got too far into them yet in any of our talks, if they would have plundered all that stuff or not. But if there's a reason that it could kind of be in that sort of, not untouched, because obviously people lived there, but, specifically the Titan stuff or primordial stuff for some reason has either not been unearthed or found yet in that region more so than others, then I think that could definitely be a draw. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that, with the Ardor, it's an exploration of traditionalism. So, and like institutionalized culture and things of that nature. Both the positives and the negatives of what that might bring. So I could easily lean into, they would have said, no, we don't go looking for that stuff. I think there would even be a sect of the people who maybe didn't even like Titan primordial deniers. Like, you know what I mean? Like, as going as far as that. So as far as that goes, I think we could easily say, no, they wouldn't have done it. Maybe it was even or on a grand scale that some of the other cultures would have been like, hey, resources. The only thing, well, I guess that kind of covers it. If the Ardor didn't do it, and then the Orcs really didn't care. That's how I thought of it. The Orcs really don't care about that stuff. It's kind of that was my thing.
Sort of like point A to point B that I'm kind of starting to draw here with that as an option. So the Ardor, for whatever reason, just culturally were against it. Like, we know that stuff's down there, but like, it's not our place to dig that sort of stuff up. It's like not right to taint the land with that sort of, whatever the specific cultural reason is, we can figure out later. But, the Ardor now get displaced into drudgery and into, whatever. And, suddenly the Orcs are in power now, and the Orcs don't care about what they do to the land. In fact, they're actively digging through to make these places sort of swamp ready and terraforming it. So I imagine it's just kind of like that, the first people to go out west and find the gold, and they're like, whoa, this is down here? And now suddenly, because it's only been within the last, couple decades, I think that this sort of stuff has all happened in terms of Lightfall and, the Ardor being displaced and the Orcs taking power. So, the discovery that there was such a wealth of Titan stuff here would be not new, brand new news. It'd still be years old at this point. But like you say, with how little the Orcs specifically care about recovering that sort of thing, I think that it would make sense that sort of rush effect would still be happening. As the Orcs haven't been digging it up as much, and the news starts to trickle out that there's this hidden wealth of Titan tech or something, and then suddenly, one person tells another person over the course of, a couple years, and then suddenly people start to get expeditions ready, and that's going to take time and preparation too. And then now suddenly, within the last, maybe couple years, is when this kind of explosion of influx into Innis has started to come from other people who are like, you're already digging up the land, we'll just be here. In the exact same way that the Drogus are here, of you're digging up the land, we'll help you clean it up. Other people are going to want a cut of that money. The Drogus aren't going to be the only ones who are interested. So I think that could definitely be a sort of draw of hey, easy money. We'll get in. We'll pick up some of the tech on the way out, and then we'll sell it off, make a fortune, and then be a little bit less miserable in this place of Dragongrin.
Yeah. And so what I'd love to do is, if I can, I'd like to sort of hitch something to everything you just said. So yes, and I loved the idea the original Gold Rush. A lot of people thought it was just baloney. They didn't believe it. So because this dude was digging up for a structure, I think he's building a mill or something. And so he's like, "Hey, I found gold," and everyone's like, "Yeah, right. Sure you did, pops." But then someone actually had this vial of dust, this gold dust, and was like, "Hey, look what I found!" And then they were like, "Oh my god, it's real!" And then people started going nuts, selling everything they have and move it. So let's take everything you said, and then let's try to find some sort of new recent inciting incident for a sort of a new influx and a new interest. So, like, I don't know, I just had this vision of maybe like a Drogus disaster, like some sort of awful accident that happens, whether that's arcane explosion or something where they're not following the rules or they're whatever. So one of those crazy like accidents where it's like, oh, that's even has a name to it. But this place was known like, yeah, hey, if you might go out there, you might find some stuff, but then they do a thing and there's maybe a big cave-in or a big something, and then there's an area that's like, oh wow, within X square miles, like this cave-in revealed that there's a high concentration right underneath here. And so just to create this brand new influx of, you know, one of the character connections to like one of the cruxes, maybe one of the cruxes could even be like a treasure hunt, like a gold mine or something. But anyway, the idea was that I could see an adventuring party having one person in it fairly easily. That would be like, well, I'm going to find these Arkans, you know, that kind of thing. Just so that it's more recent. So it's not like, oh, 20 years ago, I might go over there. But, you know, does that all make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, to kind of go back to the whole gold rush metaphor thing, like there were kind of multiple waves as like different discoveries were kind of made and people like went out to those areas, and so it's like, okay, well, yeah, we've kind of cleaned up, and, you know, the other people are kind of like, oh, yeah, I guess we missed our chance, you know, everyone's already out there. And then suddenly 20 miles north or whatever, somebody else finds another stash, and then it reignites that same fire. So yeah, I totally dig the idea that there is some sort of, yeah, accident that led to a discovery, you know, of like they thought that they had mostly like, okay, there was this huge rush in. Some people have kind of settled here as part of that. Other people have already taken their stash and left. And then boom, something happens. And that kind of finds an entire new untapped stash of it. That's kind of reignited the rush. So maybe this is, depending on what we have for other ideas, maybe this is kind of digging into space that we want to fill with something else. But we had kind of flipped around with the idea of not knowing exactly what the savage frontier is. Maybe that's part of it, of like, you know, this entire, the land in Innis has kind of been tapped, not entirely, but, you know, enough that it's not a huge deal. But then as the sort of savage frontier starts to get not entirely explored, but, you know, people start to venture out past the borders a little bit, and then suddenly they find a stash there, and it's like, oh, you know, it's dangerous and there's something terrible out there that's yet undecided of what that terrible thing is. But, you know, so maybe that's part of it, but maybe that's starting to tie people in too much into the savage frontier specifically and not into Innis the place. I could see that kind of being like circumventing the issue rather than solving it, but just kind of spitballing. Yeah.
I'm into both of those. It could be like maybe a both and, where it's like there's an area. Okay, I'm just imagining the way that I know sort of the human condition works, and it's like, what if there's an area just outside the savage frontier that it's like, yeah, there's definitely some new stuff here. There's absolutely some new stuff here, but you can almost literally see stuff in the crazy dangerous place. So it's like, so here's what I'm thinking, because like I said, the high concept is that there was this thing called the Age of Annihilation. There's an extinction event, and both sides basically were obliterated in you know, and so what you find is this evidence of these wars, these structures. The primordials have their lairs, the titans have their, you know, all either buried or scattered in pieces. What if the kind of, and this might be pulling too much into Innis when it's not necessarily made to be this thing, but what if this particular place, what was unearthed, was a battlefield with actual whole titans and whole primordials that were somehow preserved, or something like that, or maybe just one whole titan that's been totally unearthed, or something strange that would kind of make it very attractive, like, oh, wow, if there's a whole one, or maybe it's two locked in combat. You know, we've seen like some of those statues of people who have either protected each other or were fighting. So I don't know if do you think that's too much, like making Innis a thing that it wasn't intended to be, or?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think at that point that does start to, yeah, it's difficult because it's one of those situations where it's like, that as an idea is like insanely appealing to me. Like I love everything about, uncovering this like entire whole thing and it's starting this like whole gold rush sort of event. But I think you are right in the fact that that has little to do with orcs and this sort of mounting war tension sort of thing. Like it's just completely outside of that. So it is a good draw and reason for the party to be in Innis, but it's not a good reason for the party to engage in what's happening in Innis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's almost a reason for them to ignore it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, you orcs and Marrow, you fight it over there, since we're just going to be on the frontier anyways, gathering up this titan.
Getting the gold. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is one of those kill your darling scenarios where I feel like this is a really good thing to use in someplace else.
Yeah. Or so another option would be to just make that the Savage Frontier in some sort of way. So that way we can still have it, it's still there, but it's not.
Yeah. It's not the proper, and that makes sense. And that does sort of track, like that could work because it is also furthest flung. It's as far as you can get, like southeast in Dragongrin is that sort of swamp area. So, okay, we'll say this. Aside from the reason, or for the Savage, so do we, and we don't have to decide this now, but because I'm thinking there are some regions that are a little more like, as an example, Jahar. Jahar is just about the whole kind of the high concept is like Indiana Jones style treasure hunting. And so I'm like, maybe that's stepping a little bit on that's toes because I feel like that would be more useful to have a Savage Frontier in Jahar that's like, oh, and this brand new thing's unearthed, because you want your catch penny explorers and your wanderers and your desert nomads already. It's kind of lends to more that style. So maybe we should make it so that it's like Gold Rush in Jahar.
Yeah. Yep, that's totally fair. I forgot that was kind of part of Jahar's sort of identity as a theme. So yeah, in that case, definitely, I think it's better just to scrap that in Innis and just say like that's maybe a thing in Jahar that happened, that they like found some intact Titan citadel or a full Titan corpse or whatever in Jahar, and that'll be a thing that we do in Jahar. But yeah, I'm totally cool just to save that idea. Keep everything that we said, but just cut and paste from Innis into Jahar. I think it fits so much better there.
It does, because there wouldn't be a bunch of people wandering around, and we wouldn't have to explain why it wasn't pillaged for 20 years, and it's like, it just makes way more sense.
All right, so that does still leave us then with the problem. So, okay. Something's like almost a thing in my head. It's like not quite there. So, if the orcs are sort of this, not industry in the sense of like modernity and technology, but they have this sort of like industrious, not militant, but I think you know what I mean, the sort of like industrious vibe to them. They kind of have this very like organized and like planned sort of changing of terrain and kind of building of their sort of cultural icons. And they also have a lot of weird relationships to the bleak, I think you mentioned. So maybe it's a sort of, maybe the tie to get other people here is a sort of wealth of information unique to them that other people don't have in other regions. So if you're having problems with the bleak, or if you're, want some agricultural advancement, almost like the way that and it's a the term itself isn't great, but like an indentured, instead of saying indentured servitude, I'll say apprenticeship sort of thing of like they have agriculture on lock. They have the sort of land altering terraforming thing on lock. They have this bleak ritual magic on lock. So if you want any of those things, if you're struggling with your farm or if you're struggling with the bleak or whatever, you go and see some weird guy in Innis about it who can help teach you. So maybe it's a sort of pilgrimage isn't quite the right word because I think that has a very specific like connotation to it. But yeah, of just we're having problems with this, and they know how to do that stuff over in Innis. So they have a very specific culture. You'll probably have to respect what they do and follow in with their certain customs for a little bit. But if you do, they'll teach you the ways, for a price or in exchange for some sort of contract or whatever it is. But that could be a cool way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I dig it, and I think that it kind of pushes against, and not necessarily in a bad way, but it would probably have to be worked into how we define the orcs' culture. Because I guess in my mind, I sort of had some baggage that went along with it, but I thought, okay, these orcs are probably pretty closed off, is what I was thinking. Now, they don't have to be. That's not something where I'm like, hey, I think the orcs should be closed off. But what I'm saying is, I don't know that would they be as welcoming to just like you said, you have to kind of follow their customs and all that. But if you come approaching this orc camp, what do? Do they let you in? Do they take you as a slave? So I think that there's something there, but that's kind of my initial thought is, are they too closed off and ritualistic and traditional to accept just anybody to come and be, or are they open to it because they want to proliferate their beliefs?
Yeah, and I think that there's kind of a way to have it both ways, where it's kind of the tropey thing of like the karate master like only teaching the student after they've like refused them 5 times and the students persisted and they've done this so there's some sort of like, obviously not like that literally, but some sort of like, if you're gonna do this, you have to prove that you're not just using us for knowledge, that you're becoming one of us in some sort of tangible way and spreading that knowledge as a not proselytizing, because obviously that has a very religious connotation, but that you're advocating not just for our knowledge but for our culture, and that as we give you the knowledge, we also give you the culture, and you have to take both sort of thing. So they only take certain people in, like they're very selective with who they take as apprentices. Like it's not just anybody. It's not like a for-profit college where you just sign up and pay the tuition and you show up, that there's some sort of selection process and like a very careful allowance, and that there's sort of a lot of cultural baggage that they teach as part of their apprenticeship that has to be respected and assimilated into the person learning it. So that way it's not just like, oh yeah, we take whoever and we'll just give away all our secrets. But there's kind of something to some level of assimilation you have to do with the orc culture for them to accept you. And then they start to teach you. And then only after they've taught you and you've done X number of years or whatever of learning and growing as part of them, that then you're allowed to then go back and take that to help with whatever you needed to do. So that sort of thing. Maybe that's a way to kind of, so that they're still closed off and insular, but not so much so that, that we can still kind of include that as a method of drawing other people in.
Yeah, I love that. And I have an idea to sort of layer right on top of it. So the idea is, in addition to all the knowledge that they have and that rigorous process, as you say, where they vet who they allow, they have these ties to the bleak, and they have these ties to these traditions and all this kind of stuff. I think it would be really cool to lean into also the ability, they have like, they're known as prophets, and maybe even I'm kind of okay with them being known as being maybe some of the strongest, most adept spellcasters in Dragongrin. Where they're very tied in, so that if you have any sort of arcane, like even to the point to where they would know maybe the old spells, and maybe that, you know, just kind of this like font of strange old knowledge, prophecy. So basically make them a source of information that not only would be pre-Lightfall, but also sort of like oldest ages of Dragongrin, you know, as far back as the orcs were. And then the other thing to layer on top of that, even kind of like put a cherry on it, is they do have these healing pits. And so the most desperate of people would bring their sick and dying loved ones and make these pilgrimages. And so for all those reasons, I think the apprenticeship you mentioned, layered on top of it with knowledge and arcane and sorcery, like really connect them into magic, and then the healing, I was like, that's a pretty strong trifecta to bring as a general boilerplate why people would go there. And then you got all your normal adventure stuff.
Yeah, of course. So there's still the whole layer of just opportunistic adventuring of just like, well, there's money to be made and there's fighting to be fought, and, you know, all that sort of stuff. But I super, obviously the thing, I was going to actually say the exact same thing with the healing pits of like a sort of like bring your people to Jesus sort of feel to it, of like, we have this thing that's like basically just a miracle in the ground. Like, so if you have nowhere else to turn, and no other way, you know, for something, that it would make a lot of sense for there to be a sort of, you know, a magnet for the sort of sick and dying and desperate sort of thing, like you say, of like, no one else will heal me, you know, the clerics aren't allowed to do whatever in my region, or I don't know anybody, or don't have the money, or whatever the reason is. So I'm going to just try to get to Innis, and maybe they'll, you know, let me in the pits or whatever. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. The thing with the magic too, I super love that. And it kind of changes ever so slightly, like in my mind, the way that these orcs are. So I think it's very easy for orcs to just kind of fall into that natural, just like, yep, they're just the savage warriors, and they have their swords and their spears, and they do the killing. So turning them into still a bit on the wild side with how much their magic is tied into the bleak, but, you know, having, I super love the idea of them being very magically adept, and this sort of like old secret knowledge, like you say, spells long forgotten by the other regions, more under the control of the dismembered lord, that still have thrived here in the Orcish culture, that it's been allowed to maintain as part of the peace that's gone so far, and that would draw a lot of people into wanting to learn what that might be. And that gave me another idea too, of kind of ensuring that people who come here for your knowledge, like, assume part of the cultural identity. It just a sort of brainstorming, total jumping off point. So maybe this isn't something that makes the cut, but an idea that I had of, if their magic is so heavily tied into the bleak, I imagine a lot of their sort of cultural identity too probably has to draw a lot from the bleak too, in terms of like mythology and sort of unity, sort of appreciating the sort of grand calamitous aspect. So maybe as part of the apprenticeship, to like ensure that their culture is drawn on, maybe they have some ritual that like scars them with the bleak or connects them to it in some way, and that in order to learn their trades, you have to also undergo this sort of like initiation bleak scarring ritual that kind of connects you culturally to them too. Maybe that's going a little bit too far with it, but it's an idea that I had as a way to kind of really solidify of like, no, if you're going to be one of us, you're going to be one of us, and that's going to be a cost, but it's going to be a benefit, sort of thing.
I sort of love that. I always love that sort of stuff, because not only is it really ripe for conflict, it's just it makes it's a good enough barrier of entry that it answers the sort of top level question of, well, then why doesn't everybody? I like there to be some sort of price for admission for a lot of this cool stuff, because then you have to make a character choice. And I like that you're like, no, I'm going to go there and I'm going to do this. And yeah, it's going to cost me. But I mean, you're talking, that's a campaign arc, and that can be really cool. So I really like that. And then while you were saying that, it made me think, many of them will not accept money for anything that they do. But I thought it would be kind of cool to tie it back into the prophecy. I think it would be kind of cool if we could find a way that holds water to make it so that the way that they take payment is in these sort of strange and esoteric things. I just love it. I don't know what that looks like. And you can have, I mean, that's like, to me, that's roll table dynamite, where it's like, this is the price, where it's like, and I don't know how deep we want to go with it, where it's like a shaman takes one of your memories, or if it's like, you have to go on a pilgrimage, or even keeping it more vague than that, like, a serpent must swallow a dove. And that means something to them, but then you as the player and as the game master got to figure out what that means to you, and then you kind of overlay it on top of stuff. So, like, I just love that whatever we decide for it to actually firm up into, I think that would just make it another reason to go wandering in there and talking to these crazy orcs.
Okay, yeah. I love that, yeah. And I'm with you. Anytime that you can make a transaction cost anything else other than, like, here's a pile of gold, like, I'm all for it. And I think it makes a lot of sense that the cost for esoteric services would not be, it's not like going to the psychic shop down the road of, like, the person who just, like, rented out the space and will give you a tarot reading for $20 or whatever. That there's some sort of real, so kind of, and I'm not familiar enough to, like, deep dive into it, so I'm going to kind of keep the explanation vague, because I don't want to, like, get into any cultural practices that I'm not familiar with. But I know that there's a lot of sort of cultures that still have a lot of old traditions to them, where they'll have these sort of, like, shamanic rite of passages and initiation things that you can do, of, like, you have to learn all these things and you have to kind of assimilate into these different cultural things, and then kind of afterwards you are kind of granted not membership into it, but some sort of kind of bigger connection to them as people through the shared rituals and customs that you've kind of gone through. And I love the idea that there's some sort of similar thing with these people, not drawing onto the shamanic thing too much, because I think that's a little tired with orcs particularly, and kind of gets into some weird shaky territory. But some sort of thing like that of, yeah, it's going to cost you, experience in some way. And kind of leading into the prophecy, kind of to jump off of that a little bit more, of something that kind of brought into my mind as you were saying it, of what if it's kind of part of the culture that they have these sort of prophetic ideas and visions, but, it's the sort of future that to realize it, you have to make it happen. Like, it's not, the prophecies aren't guaranteed. It's like, this could happen, and it could be real, but for it to be real, you have to realize it in some sort of way. And maybe that's part of the price of, like, I've had this prophetic vision, and I need to make sure that it happens. It's very important to me that it happens. So if I'm going to teach you this, there's going to be some time where you're going to have an opportunity to move my vision into reality. And in that spot, I'm going to need you to do the right thing and help that vision to become real. It's sort of like, it's prophecy, but only in the sense that you make it prophecy. And that part of the deal is that once you learn their magic or their skill or whatever trait you learn from them, that when you take that back to wherever you're from and sort of use it, that there's some exercising of using that power to help bring about a vision that they've had about a place or about themselves or something like that. That might be a way to kind of tie it all together in an interesting sort of way. Or maybe that's even the price up front. Like, I'll only teach you after, something has been made real as part of my, there's a lot of specifics and we don't have to wallow in the details too much here. But I think that could be a really cool space to explore with it.
Yeah, I really love everything about that. And, just to kind of touch on something that, I mean, this is kind of like a hack that I use, which is find one person who runs D&D like another person. It just doesn't happen. So, like, I know that what I like to do is, if I'm explaining a piece of lore where I'm like, oh, that's cool, but this is also cool, that I'll put, some make you do it first. Others make you walk alongside them and da-da-da, while still others make you blah, 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 and go to your homeland and practice these things. And then that way you've got this nice triangle where the game master can kind of either choose one or pick this sort of plot out a point somewhere in between. The other thing that really hit me, like, while you were talking is, that is kind of a cool way to make it so that the players can sort of play orcs without being orcs. Meaning, like, it's this very, like, stranger in an outside culture becoming accepted kind of thing. Like, and there are so many examples of that in literature and pop culture and film and et cetera. But my thought process is that, and the orcs know this, they're wise, they understand that if you actually do follow their tenets to get what you want, usually what you want changes in the middle. and so, you know what I mean? So it's like, kind of like, I think that there would be, and this could just be something, we're going to have a section that of the book that has these factions. They're not going to be nearly as detailed as the cultures, but there will be, there are different cultures in the world that aren't playable, but they still have to have a quick write-up. That's breakout box scenario where I think it would be, basically you can play as a Mog Tarok, but you're not orc. In some rare cases, the Darrow and, like, even Tome Hearts and Festir and all, like, you follow this prophetic path and then you're a Mog Tarok orc. I think that makes it way cooler and more, it's very unique. It's not just like orcs versus humans. It's more like, no, we're fairly accepting of anyone who truly believes what we believe. And I think that's kind of just a neat angle to have.
Yeah, I super dig it. For one, I think it breaks a lot of sort of just tired stereotypes about the way that orcish culture usually works. Where they're the industry leaders, in a lot of ways in Dragongrin. So yeah, the fact that the orcs are, like, smart and that they've got a very established culture and plan, and that they use that information that they have, this sort of advancement over a lot of other people in, like, agriculture and industry and magic, to help to spread their own beliefs and their cause. And yeah, I totally love what you said of, like, anyone can be an orc. You can't play as an orc, but you can play as a Mog Tarok by virtue of having kind of integrated into their culture after adapting their practices and learning their ways. And they're like, yeah, you follow all our rules, you have all our powers, you're basically one of us. Obviously, you're not literally the same heritage as us, to use the mechanical term, but you've kind of proven that you're here for the right reasons and that you're here for the long haul, and so you get to be here. And I think that also gives a lot of cool ways to have players. So my worry kind of going into some of this was like, so this is still a great way to get people to come to Innis, but there's a difference between people kind of coming and then leaving and people being in Innis. So, like, if I'm making a player character who's going to be from Innis, or we're playing in Innis and I'm going to be native to Innis, or at least not native as in the characters live there, but like they're from there mechanically, that how are these people kind of living their life in Innis? But this has kind of become such like an established process. And like you say, there's going to be some amount of people who, as they learn the culture, just decide that they like it and decide that they're going to just join that instead. So I love the idea that I could be a human, in Innis, who is basically a native member of Innis in the orcish culture, just not an orc. And I think that gives a lot of powerful player options to kind of bridge that gap between So this is kind of getting a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's important of like, if you can't be the orcs, you need some reason to still be a part of what's happening in Innis. And I think that this way that we've kind of gone about it is a great way to make that happen. So that you can be a human in Innis who cares about the things happening in Innis, and have a reason for that to be the case. And I think that that's a really nice way to make that happen. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it highlights the Ixis, which is sort of the more way traditionalist orcs, and it's like the situation is that you could be all in and accepted and everything's great and you can live among them for 2 years and then they find you dead, flayed on a rock. Because the traditionalist Ixis orcs found the time when you were alone and did some horrible ritual on you and just killed you because you're an outsider. And that's like, I think that draws a hard line as to why they would disagree with the Mog Turok. And like, the Mog Turok are like, no, everyone is accepted. Like, if they follow what we're doing. And the Ixis are like, no, that's not how it goes. And I just think that makes it also makes, because again, I always like to answer the high level question, well, then why wouldn't everybody? And the answer is, well, it still has its own set of, aside from the difficulties of, like you said, you know, the actual rituals and, following that crucible of actually, going through the process of learning all their stuff and being genuine. There's actually something about like, nah, because I don't want to get killed by a gang of orcs when I wander down the wrong alley. And then something else that sort of dawned on me while we were talking was, I think another simple way, okay, the military, whenever they go and dwell somewhere long enough, usually outposts pop up, and those outposts turn eventually into towns, and those towns turn into cities. I think that we should have a smattering of outpost cities that I kind of got this vibe that the Innis Marrow are very removed from a lot of the other day-to-day Dragongrin, knee-breaky kind of harass the citizens. And they, honestly, I imagine them like drinking a cup of coffee, standing on the wilderness fence, just very isolated. And so it's easy to forget the fervor and the, so I think that they would be, they're still Marrow, but I think that there would be these outpost cities where they would kind of be welcoming of heroes to guard the walls within reason. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of touchy ground, but I think the idea that, I don't know, maybe you could be from this place, maybe you were born there, I don't know, but I like the idea of these kind of outpost cities that are like, it makes perfect sense militaristically that they would have grown over the last 20 years into, some of these. Does all that make sense? I mean, does that hold water to you, or?
Yeah, so I think that there's a very big difference with Innis compared to the other regions, in the sense that the other regions, the Marrow, are kind of enforcers of a conquest, where here in Innis, they're more, at least right now, arbiters of a treaty, which I think is a very, very, very big difference, of like the military occupying another place versus the military kind of having some access to the place as part of an agreement. So because the Dismembered Lord made a deal with Innis that they're going to be out of it, so the Marrow is still kind of there to make sure that the tenets of that agreement are being followed, and some of that's starting to go sour it's at the beginning stages of that going sour. But until then, that they wouldn't have any sort of reason to be as domineering as they were to the other cultures, because this is a place that's in a peaceful agreement with the Dismembered Lord rather than being subjugated by the Dismembered Lord. And the Dismembered Lord still kind of owns it in a certain kind of aspect, but the way that it's come about here versus the other places is so different that I think it would make tons of sense that the Marrow were just kind of like, yeah, we're here. We're going to like watch to make sure that nothing absolutely catastrophic happens, but otherwise, I mean, it's not our business to, go around swinging clubs unless we need to. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Cool. And that gives now some very different options too. I like that a campaign in Innis would feel very different because there are different kinds of dangers. It's not just, you know what I mean? I really dig that. I like this direction. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think, is there anything else major you really wanted to hit on? I kind of had maybe like another, I mean, I'm not like in a rush, but I was thinking maybe like another 10 minutes or so, like have it like a nice 2-hour block.
So one thing that we still have yet to dive into, and maybe this would be more time than that, and it's totally cool. We don't have to do it right now. But the only other thing on my list is that we have yet to sort of lock down in any way at all a sort of outside threat and savage frontier for Innis. And maybe, as I'm kind of just saying that, maybe the outside threat for Innis is just that other orc faction. Like the Mog Tarak are sort of the people, and then the other faction of orcs, whose name I have immediately forgotten. The Ixis, yeah. Maybe they're the outside threat. Like, I know it's different than the way that we're doing it in the other regions, in the sense that they're still like culturally integrated rather than like the flesh cauldrons or the rot fiends or whatever. But it could, because you can't play them or have really any cultural involvement with them, they would still be a very dangerous sort of threat. Maybe that's going in a weird direction, and it's better just to make it some other monster, and that we're kind of using space unwisely in terms of the region layout. But that's an idea. But yeah, an outside threat and a savage frontier are still kind of the big points that I have no idea on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, okay, so as you said that, I'm thinking, for the sake of making it just suck worse for the players, what if the Ixis and the Mog Tarak, and this might not work with how traditionalist they are, but what if they look the same? And I don't mean look the same. I mean, maybe what if the Ixis is similar to sort of, it is a very unpopular old belief, and it's something that people believe in secret. They don't wear Ixis garb and do. It's more like they secretly are these sons of the Harpy. You know what I mean? And kind of like, so with that said, I'm okay with them being sort of the monstrous threat. Now, the ones that you mentioned, the Flesh Cauldron and the Rot Fiends, I've kind of thought of those as the thematic monster. And then the outside threat was like the Thought Slayers. So like the extra, this faction that's sort of removed from anything else that is like, hey, we got our own awful thing going on over here that we're trying to impose. So I kind of I think it's important that the thematic monster is the orc. And we make them look like, because in what other way will they be represented? Meaning, as you're flipping through the pages of the book, you want to have this Mog Tarak or Ixis. And what we could do is, stat block wise, same sort of base stats, but then you give the Ixis one of those add-on blocks that gives them like maybe some crazy spells or like different like secret ceremonial weapons or something that are just, you know, kind of separate. So I think you're on to something there. One thing I was just going to say, though, is I had this crazy idea while I was on vacation, and I actually worked on the book a lot on vacation, because vacation just basically meant no day job, lots of time to work. So it was like I would do family activities like in the day, and then toward the evening when the family kind of settled down in the hotel or whatever, I would just sit on the laptop. But nowhere in Dragongrin right now is there featured, and this might be too many monstrous races, so this might be like, hey, pump the brakes. The Dragonborn. Now, Dragonborn in our world are called Dragonbound, and they're not playable as a race, and they are these sort of servants of the dragons of old who have died, and their whole deal is usually finding the graves of these dragons and doing X, Y, and Z with them. Either tending them or trying to resurrect them. Like crazy stuff. I wanted to make them sort of like scary, monstrous things. I didn't know if it would be too much to have the Dragonbound in the swamps down at the bottom, sort of as the more savages coming in and just like raising things and killing, and just so the Marrow and the Orc both have to worry about them. So these Dragonbound are like these big sort of savage, basically take all the stuff we wanted to avoid doing with the Orc and apply it to the Dragonborn and kind of make them the big like that, almost like Mongols or something, where they're just kind of like sweeping up and they just want to destroy everybody because there's a Grin there or there dragons buried there. I don't know. How does any of that hit you?
Yeah, so yeah, it is a bit kind of out there in terms of like it's such like a shock to the system to have all these orcs and then like Dragonborn, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Plus, I think it kind of lends itself to some nice conflict with the different factions within the orc, of like how some of them are kind of leaning towards like gearing up to revolution, and the others are like, no, we need to keep things calm and keep the peace. Of like, why are you starting fights with a dismembered lord when we haven't even solved our Dragonborn problem yet, sort of thing. So it would make a sort of a good way to kind of cause some fissions within the orc's attention focus and the sort of cultural, kind of divides a cultural monolith into different sort of fragments of like, some people are like, no, rebellion. Yeah, we have to stake our ground. We won't get anywhere if we're not ambitious and go for it. And then other people are like, we have problems on all fronts right now, and you're trying to fight everything when we need to pump the brakes here and focus over here, or vice versa, or whatever. So yeah, I like the idea that there's kind of some other sort of cultural threat winding in that direction. And yeah, I think if we don't have anywhere else that the Dragonborn are going, then I think it could make sense for them to kind of have migrated in this direction.
And so that's the thing, is that there are a couple of places they could go, like as we figure out, like, because a lot has shifted as we've sort of added these themes over all the regions, which I think makes them way more rich. But all that to say, if we did want to do something else, right, that might just be dialing up like the dial a little too much for that region, maybe. But if it was, what we've kind of decided was, okay, this swamp down in the south, well, first of all, it doesn't technically have to fully be a swamp. It looks like a swamp on the map, and that's part of the Ixis, and the theme that we had kind of going was the Ixis took things way too far, and it sort of started to eat their land, like in the worst way. These pits that could basically bring back the dead were just too volatile. And so that's why the Mogturok spread out and took the deal and have these more managed, almost regulated pits. That said, I kind of like that chunk of lore. So what would come out of that? What would come out of these volatile? And so I'm just thinking of like, is it... Because Sphere is already loaded with undead. We have that kind of covered. So I'm like, I didn't know, but I mean, there's that too. Is there something underserved in the lore that, like, maybe doesn't have a spot in Dragongrin, like some kind of classic D&D stuff, that when you put them on top of these awful pits is kind of like, ooh, like super goblins, or I don't know. I keep trying not to do like a normal monstrous humanoid, and I'm trying to think of something like really interesting and thematic that wouldn't also overshadow, you know?
So, this is going into potentially over-the-top world, so I'm ready for a cutoff anytime. But
okay.
So I guess just to kind of clarify, is this sort of southern swamp area still part of Innis, or are you thinking that's like the Savage Frontier now that it's kind of gone off the rails?
I think it's the Savage Frontier. And yeah, all of these outside threats have typically the way that the formatted regions are, like the Thought Slayers are featured in the Savage Frontier. The Villanavi are featured in the Savage Frontier. So whatever we...
Okay.
Yeah. So this would be the Savage Frontier.
So, what if... Okay.
Oh man, I
have
can't
to
wait.
Brace myself for this one.
Okay, all right, I'm ready.
So, these sort of like undead pits, like they aren't strong enough to bring back the full real thing. But what if this swamp, as the orcs kind of continue to expand and build out these pits, they kind of like accidentally built the casino on the graveyard, the sort of trope of like, what if there was some specific sort of dragon's grin that they accidentally built into, and the power wasn't enough to bring back the dragon. I'm not going Draco-lich or anything, but what if there's almost like the petrified eggs in Game of Thrones sort of thing, how they thought that the eggs were gone. Yeah. So the pits can't bring back the dead dragon, but maybe there was these sort of like other reptilian creature eggs and the dragonborn or dragonsworn or what? God, I forgot the name already. I'm so bad with the names.
Dragonbound.
Dragonbound. Some sort of thing there that it didn't bring them back from the dead because they weren't technically dead, but it kind of these like unhatched eggs of this sort of culture kind of hit this regenerative energy of the swamp, and they've started to break out now and have started to spread out from the region. And that's why the Dragonborn are here, and they don't even have to be the big main enemy. You can have some other like reptilian, the wyverns or basilisks, some sort of other thing that's kind of a descendant of the dragon or kind of offshoot of the dragon in some way. And that these things have started to not come back because they were never here, but they've started to come into being, and the eggs have started to hatch, and they've started to kind of crawl out from these what have accidentally become like incubation chambers.
I am so into that. It makes so much sense. Like, I love it when an idea connects just enough to be like, yeah, I'll buy that. And I think this goes a step beyond that, where I'm like, that makes so much sense that it's like, that would happen in the real world. So I love it, and I think that figuring out what exact shape that takes, like you said, basilisks, wyverns, like maybe all of it. Here's an interesting thing. I've always wanted to have just these dangerous little deadly kobolds. Like, I want to just sort of like Dragongrinify them. And so, okay, that actually is really cool, because then it could be, maybe it's just sort of like a pepper box of dragon kind. Like, it's not maybe just one specific thing, but it's kind of all of the above. It's like your wyverns, your dragonbound, your kobolds, your drakes. It's just like, listen, these eggs had varying degrees of success, growth, mutation even, and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I think that actually could be like super rad.
Yeah, and I think like having like what's basically like a full buried dragon intact here makes it so it's like, okay, but why would people ever go there? Well, it's like there's a pretty good reason to go there. Like, stuff made out of dragon, pieces, for lack of a more refined term, and just dragon kin sort of things, like those materials tend to be very valuable, but also very dangerous to get, because the creatures that have those things are usually very scary. So yeah, I kind of like this area that we've kind of stumbled backwards into, of like they accidentally kind of incubated the dragonkin eggs that have been stored here, and it's not enough to do anything about the dragon that's still dead. And I don't want to even touch into that at all. I think that would be kind of going a little bit into a bad direction with it. But that all these other things have started to kind of, there's kind of this proto-genesis of dragonkin life kind of coming off from this spot because of the orcish pits that have kind of brought them all in. And like you say, it's just kind of the full cornucopia of the kobolds and wyverns and basilisks and just sort of dragon-like reptilian creatures have kind of started to explode and really take a hold here in this southern swamp area. And that some of that's kind of started to proliferate out, and the Dragonbound have started to make trouble on kind of the southern border of Innis now, coming from the Savage Frontier, in the same way that the Thoughtstain have started to kind of infiltrate into Sphere. I think that kind of going a similar sort of idea with it here. where it's like they've kind of exploded out and they've kind of built this own culture for themselves there of this sort of monstrous craziness. But, they're hitting their capacity and they need to expand now, and that's going to bump into Innis, at some point.
Yeah, and I love that because what it means is that if you kind of check the boxes, we have the subverted, twisted versions of all of these fantasy tropes. So now you can be trekking along in Innis and see what you think is a dragon. Now, it's a wyvern, but do you think that the common person is going to go, ha, clearly it's a wyvern. Don't worry. No, there are going to be tales of dragons from the south, and people are going to be like, the dragons are rising again, and all this kind of crazy stuff. So very quickly, I want to tell you what the grins are, because they're not just graves. And so maybe this would also factor in. It also might be one too many flavors on the sundae, where you're like, So, as we know, the word grin is actually Titan speak for grave. So, the Dragongrin is the graveyard of the dragon. So, the final resting places of these scattered, these defeated ancient dragons, they're all over the place. Now, here's the thing. This is kind of the crazy lore we have with it. It didn't make sense to me that there would be all these tombs built around the corpses of dragons. Like, who would have done that? So it was kind of like, well, we have to come up with a cool reason that makes sense and is also sort of like rad, where it's like, oh no. So these deadly labyrinthine constructions were not built by mortal hands. Essentially, the essences of these rotting dragon carcasses are so powerful and so just, it's almost like magical draconic radioactivity that these structures actually sprang into existence, like spawning from them, growing almost from their subconscious, that like they creep up from the landscape, embodying the personality and the type of dragon that they protect. And basically, so that's the idea, is that these dragon grins are like if the psyche of a dragon could become a tangible physical structure and then expand outward as much as it could. So now put that on top of Orcish breeding pits or healing pits. So these things are kind of doing this anyway. So I am going to maybe jump the shark and say that there is a possibility that if there was a living dragon in Dragongrin, this would be the place. Or one that could potentially become alive during the course of play.
Okay, so yeah, I love that. I'm super into the whole like the dying dragon is like such an experience that it kind of like its dying subconscious can still like spawn things. That's super cool. That gave me an idea of, I'm sure, and I'm totally guessing here, but it makes sense to me that at a certain point, once the dragon is fully dead, that that structure can only go out so far before that power is sort of spent. I'd imagine. So that structure can only get so big before it's like, okay, the dragon's kind of used up its last creative vestiges in its death, and like this is as big as this thing's going to be. But maybe the pits aren't enough to bring this dragon back to life, but it's just enough to sort of keep that creative subconscious force driving, and this structure is continuing to grow where the other ones have all stopped. Does that make sense?
It makes the most sense. It's dialing it back just enough. Oh, God, okay. And so it could even be like, codename Evergrin, but it's basically like whatever cool name we come up with, or like even like a playoff Creeping Death where it's like, the Creeping Grin or something where it's like Zerg Creep, where it is just this grin itself is growing, so you'd have to figure out a way to stop it, or the grin itself would get so big and prolific. Oh, that's really rad. So imagine crazy superstructure. It looks like someone's building something. But maybe, like you say, these eggs and these different things are kind of pouring out of it. And so maybe they are like tending to it and sort of, they're not building it, but they're clearing paths for it to grow and things. And now that gives them something to be doing.
Yeah, they're trimming the hedges, so to speak. And
Exactly.
making sure that it builds in correctly.
Right. And so like the Dragonbound are like, you know, having these armies of these like kobolds do these things and that things and the drakes and all this. It's like there's just this dragonkin swamp situation. I feel like that's pretty lockable in. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm with you. I dig it.
Cool, man. Well, nice. Anything else that we need to? I don't know how you can top that.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I think we might just want to quit while we're ahead on that one. I think that's a pretty awesome sort of final point to lock in. And I think the rest of it's going to start to dive into like the very, very nitty gritty. Like we could figure out what the other crux is going to be or something like that. But I think, we're mostly at a part where we've got the foundation built of this place and we can build in the small pieces later. But I think as far as like locking in important big picture elements, that we've kind of hit, I think, a good stride with it. And to me, that's like so much more difficult and important. Like once you have the themes and the big pieces, getting the details is easy. We could fill that page out in a night, but getting to this point is the difficult part. But yeah, I'm super happy with where it ended up.
Yeah. And it's way more of a journey that takes time and concentrated effort. It's like, it's not something you can sit down and say, well, I'm going to write 2,000 words. I'm going to figure out the high concept. It's usually what we did. I mean, at least once in this conversation, we were like, we got all the way to the finish line and said, nope, back it up, wrong turn. And that's just not something you can shortcut. So killer, man. Awesome. Well, I guess let's end it here. And this has been amazing. And I'm excited to now take all these ideas and overlay it on top of all the existing information that's in there. But I think that's taking these steps and doing this is what's making this book way more thematic and usable and evocative.
Yeah, exactly. It takes it from, there's a big line between like what I would just call like historical information of like, here is a place and here are some cultures and here are some beliefs or whatever, to like, here's a place that's alive and that things are happening in that you're going to be a part of. Like, I think like bridging that gap between like information and experience is like such an important part of making these sorts of places come to life. And yeah, I think the only way that you get that is to like do these sorts of really big deep dives and work out all the details and be willing to like cut losses and experiment with crazy ideas and like. But yeah, I'm with you that it changes it from something that's just like, that's cool, to like, oh, I want to play that. And yeah, I've already had a couple of those moments here where it's just like, man, like, can I just put up that interest post right now for that game?
Right? And truly, we promised ourselves and everyone who backed the book that we weren't going to just come out with a history book. And one of the main core fundamental reasons that we decided to be late with our first Kickstarter is because we got to where we're like, all right, cool, this is done. And then it was like, this isn't what we want it to be. And it's not what we told everyone else it was going to be. It's close. It's ballparking. It's touching. But now I think we know what we need to do here. And it's going to take a long time. But we gotta. I was like, okay. And so exactly what you're saying. It's the difference between in many books. In fact, I would even venture to say most books. Everything we just talked about would have been paragraphed of what happened. Not what is happening and what you can affect and how you can change it. And I think that's a paradigm shift for this book that is going to be really fun to use.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm super excited. about all the regions in all the book. But yeah, even with just the progress that we like, Innis. Like I'll be honest. When you first kind of pitched Innis, there was a lot of kind of feeling of like, okay, well, but what do we do here? What is happening? And I think it's just a couple short days of voice message exchange, and now especially after this, it's like, oh no, this place is cool too. So that those kind of extra steps can go a super long way. And now it's become a place that I'm excited about and like can't wait to finish out the rest of the details and get it, prepped up for release and everything, because I think it's going to be super cool. But yeah, that transformation, exactly what you're saying, is super important, and it's one of the things about this book that makes me so like excited to be working on it, is that sort of elevation, I would even dare to say, of the sort of region design and sort of how that plays out to players living in those places now. I think is going to be super, super cool, and I'm very excited for people to get to see, and not just see and read, but feel and experience it in the game, because I think that's really kind of what it's going to do.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't want to take it too long here at the end, but, I think everything you just said, what we have is the biggest problem people are going to have, I think, is that they are not going to have enough time for the inspiration that a lot of this stuff is going to cause. And it's like, that is the infinite best problem to ever give a game master, is like, hey, you're gonna, if you want to, you could use this book for the next 5 years and run campaign after campaign and never use the same thing twice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, even in just the stuff that we've worked on so far, I already have like a backlog of like 9 different things of like, oh, I want to run this game. Oh, but I also want to run that game. But maybe I can. And it's just like, that's like you say, it's the best problem that you can give somebody is, too much things to do and not enough time, and have them all be cool and interesting.
Awesome, man. Well, I guess let's end it there. And this has been amazing. So thanks again. It's just amazing having you working on the book and just getting it where we want it to be. And I'm excited. I'm excited for August's deadlines, and I think we're going to obliterate them.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. This has been super fun. So thank you as well for doing this. And it's doubled as being a lot of fun and also just a lot of good progress and work. So yeah, I think that we've hit some really good ground. And I'm happy that we got to do this. And yeah, I'll just echo and say that I'm super happy to be a part of this, not just this thing here now, but all of this stuff that we've been doing. It's been super great, and I think, and I hope and think that that other people are going to think that it's really great too.